Topic for today is how do you win with LTOs? This is a continuation of some of the information that was presented at the IFMA Marketing and Sales Leaders Forum in Atlanta earlier this month, and wanted to quickly share with you sort of what's on the agenda. So I thought we would first start with a look at the LTO landscape, and then talk about what it means to have goal alignment between the manufacturer or supplier and the operator to make sure that there's a cohesive LTO strategy. The notion of innovating with a purpose as opposed to just innovating in a vacuum. And then to bring about items that are not just appealing but uniquely appealing to the consumer. Then finally what some of the building blocks for success are with LTOs. Now obviously this is something we could talk about for hours and hours and hours and hours. We have just 45 minutes, so this is not the end-all be-all, but hopefully you walk away from this session with some good things to think about and to stew about further within your organization. Real quick, to start off with a look at the types of data sources we'll be using in today's presentation. So we have a number of pieces of syndicated data that play a key part in what we analyze with regard to LTOs. This includes Insider, which tracks every new item in LTO at major chains. Something called Scores, which is really integral to understanding and winning with LTOs, which takes all the new items in LTOs that big chains do and has consumers rate all of them so you understand what is popular, what is not popular, what they like, what they don't like. We'll look at some brand data on chains as well to help understand what is the situation assessment for that particular operator or account or customer, to help you start thinking about, well, which direction should we help them take their LTOs so that we understand what our starting point is and what the end objective is as well. Then finally, we'll look at some information from Firefly, which is a data set of every single place that serves food in the country to help understand for a particular customer what are the other competitors that are nearby to where they're located that are engaging in LTO activity that they should be aware of. But we're going to start with a look at sort of the LTO landscape. So what is generally happening with LTOs? What does that long-term trend sort of look like? Where do we see LTOs as a whole going? Well, the first thing to note is that there are a lot of LTOs. And they're not just a lot of LTOs, it's that at any given chain there are a lot of LTOs. So the chart that you see on screen right now, hopefully if the lag isn't too bad, the chart that you see on the screen right now is the number of LTOs per chain and the percentage of chains that fall into each one of those categories. So 13% of all top chains do 0 to 3 LTOs per year. 9% of all chains on the far right do over 50 LTOs per year. But the thing I'd sort of call attention to are all those red bars, the percentage of chains that do more than 10 LTOs, anywhere from 11 LTOs to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 and above. That's not a minority of the market. The majority of chains do at least 11 LTOs over the course of the year. And it's sort of an important thing to remember that there is a lot of activity going on. And this has implications not just for the consumer, who is bombarded with LTOs every waking minute, it seems, but it also has some implications for us as suppliers. So when we're working with the customer on a new potential LTO idea, it might be a really big deal for us as a supplier because of the volume it could bring, but keep in mind that it's probably just one of the many ideas that they're working on throughout the course of the year. So having that context from the operator's perspective is quite important. But what's happening with LTOs over time? Well, it turns out if you look historically, the number of LTOs that chains sort of execute, it's been going up over time. If you go back, the last 10 years or so, the number of LTOs that each chain executes keeps going up. Back in 2007, it was about 14 LTOs per chain annually on average. Now we are getting close to almost double that figure. We are sort of in a period of LTO mania in a way, and there's some serious implications as to what this means. So if you think about the notion of what an LTO should be, limited time offer. It should be something a little more different, a little more special, but there are so many of them now that consumers will often tell us, I'm not really quite sure what makes this different than anything else. And I think that's one of the things that we need to help our operator customers work on is creating a real point of difference with the LTOs, and more importantly, explaining the story as to why this item is only available for 6 weeks, and this particular 6 weeks during the course of the year, as opposed to being available all the time. What is the story that explains to the consumer why this item makes sense today? And if you look at the actual chains, there is a very, very wide dynamic range in terms of the level of LTO activity. So across the top 300 chains or so, these are the ones that are most prolific in bringing new items and LTOs to the menu. Over the course of just the last 24 months, you have a chain like Dunkin' or Starbucks or Ram that's doing 150, almost 200 new items and LTOs during that time. That is a lot of activity. If you look at the other side, you have number of chains that have maybe one item over this entire period of time. So it's important to sort of understand when you're working with that customer, what has their strategy been? Do LTOs play a huge part in their menu activity, or do they have more of a structured, stable menu, and LTOs aren't necessarily something that they are looking to do? But there is, again, an extraordinary range in this, anywhere from 190, as in the most prolific, to chains that have done one over the same period of time. So really, really broad range in how much activity we see with LTOs from one chain to the next. We also know that each segment, and we'll look at this in aggregate in a moment, is predisposed to certain types of LTOs over others. So let's look at a really simplified view of this. As your screen updates, this is a chart of the percentage of LTOs that fall into a certain menu category for limited service restaurants, for full service restaurants, and for C-stores. So limited service is in blue, full service is in green, and the C-stores are in that, I don't know, pinkish color, I guess we would call it. And you see a couple of interesting things right off the bat, right? So you get a really big spike with C-stores and beverage. They have a disproportionately high share of their LTOs fall into the beverage category, whereas full-service restaurants in green, they're more likely to do alcohol, clearly, as well as meat entrees. Or limited service restaurants are more likely to have featured Mexican-type items as their LTOs. So there are certain sort of skews that you see from one major sort of segment to the next, and if we broke this out further by QSR versus fast casual or mid-scale versus casual dining, you would see other more specific skews as well. But the main lesson is that each of these broad sort of super segments is sort of predisposed to do certain types of LTOs more commonly than others. But the other thing to keep in mind is that this changes in time, over time, with market trends, right? So those priorities, those category priorities that an operator might have or that a segment might have, it's not always fixed or stable. And a really good example of this is if we look at what's been happening in the beverage area. So this is a look at C-stores versus QSR. And over the past few years, the percentage of all LTOs in each one of those two major segments that is either a food item versus a beverage item. So we saw earlier that beverages were way more prevalent in C-stores. If you go back to 2013, nearly half of all C-store LTO activity was beverage. In 2013 for QSR, that number was only 13%. It was almost 90% food, 13% beverage for QSR. Whereas for C-store, it was almost 50-50. As time has changed, we've seen a shifting of priorities for the two channels. C-stores are endeavoring to be more like restaurants, and you could see that reflected in what they've done with their LTOs, that the percentage of food as a percentage of the total LTOs has gone up. It's gone from 56% in 2013 to 72% this year. And that beverage has shrunk from 44% to 28% as C-stores do more things to become more like a restaurant. For QSR, the opposite is actually happening. They are doing more today with beverage than they have historically, and we see some reasons why. If we look at sort of the scores data that we'll talk about in just a few moments, we found, for instance, that the younger generation of consumers are way more interested than other generations in trying new beverages, and QSRs are starting to really pick up on that and bring beverages more to the fore in what they do. So you start seeing a little bit of a blurring of the lines between the two as they start pursuing more similar menu strategies with more similar ratios between them. So again, what a operator or a segment has done historically is not always a reflection of what matters to them today. Market trends change, and their priorities will change with that. So one of the questions that was asked and was really sort of central to the presentation in Atlanta at IFMA's Marketing and Sales Conference was how do you take an LTO to the full-time menu? Well, the first part of that is understanding what percentage actually make it to the full-time menu, and that number is 16%. On average, about 16% of all LTOs eventually go full-time. That golden egg turns up 1 out of every 6 times, basically. So it's not a particularly high hit ratio, and we find, too, that there are certain trends that are true of items that are more likely to make it to the full-time menu, and also there are certain categories that are more adept at making it to the full-time menu as well. That breakfast dishes, burgers, and salads over the past couple of years, those types of items, when they've debuted as an LTO, they have a higher probability of making it to the full-time menu than do others. Pizzas, breakfast pastries, and Mexican dishes that debuted as an LTO, they have had a lower retention rate onto the full-time menu over that period of time. But I think the key thing is to think, the question of how do we get our item from LTO to full-time menu may not necessarily be the right question to ask, because that's not always necessarily the same goal that all parties have. And this takes us to our first major point, which is that we as sort of manufacturers need to have strongly aligned goals with our operator customers. And we're sort of aligned in some places, but we're not naturally or organically always aligned to start with, and we need to work on that alignment process. So if you think about what a supplier might want with an LTO, we want to get stuff on the permanent menu. We, of course, want to sell more of that product as well. We want to sell more of that item. And we're partially aligned with what the operator wants, because they also want to sell more of the item, but they're not necessarily always interested in that item becoming something that goes onto their permanent menu. What the operator wants is not just product sales, but also some level of differentiation in those items that makes them a little more unique versus what might be available at another chain restaurant or at other places in general. So that notion of differentiation, that sort of helps align the operator sort of to what consumers want, because when you ask consumers what matters to you in an LTO, unique, different, those types of things bubble up really to the top. But that's not the only thing that the consumer wants. They also want to have a reason for being for the item. What they don't understand always is why the LTO even exists as an LTO, as opposed to something that's just always available all time on the menu. So we have some linkages between suppliers and operators and consumers in terms of those core desires, but there are also some other things that we need to align on. And I thought it would be helpful to take a look at what things look like from the operator's perspective. So a while back, we were fortunate enough to get some feedback from chefs that are part of ICCA. If you're not familiar with that organization, it is the top culinarian at the top 200 chains across the country. And based on this sort of limited survey, this is what those chefs told us. 85% say that they will develop LTOs often with just the goal of them being available for only a limited time, meaning that even if they sold well, they still didn't have any intention to bring them to the full-time menu. So while we might be thinking that what we want to do is get things full-time, that's not necessarily always what the operator is looking for. 100% of those chefs say that an LTO can be successful even if it doesn't make it full-time. So again, their perspective is not always ours and thinking instinctively about the full-time menu. They are sometimes thinking about just short-term success. So what do we do to sort of align with this? Well, let's think about what the consumers want. If you ask the consumer what is the most important thing that should differentiate an LTO from a regular menu item, the thing that comes up the most is the notion of seasonal flavors. We want certain flavors during the summer. We want different flavors during the fall. But if you think about that, the notion of seasonal flavors is sort of at intrinsic odds with the notion of having something available full time, right? You want something that's only available for the certain time of year when it matters most, which is the opposite of something that would be available full time. So you think about where we line up. The supplier wants something available on a full-time menu, but that's what we want as manufacturers. We want full-time menu placement, but The operator says, I'm not always thinking full-time. Consumers say, I want seasonal things, which basically means I don't want something that's available year-round. What do you do to align? And one of the things that we heard from Jim Taylor from Arby's, who presented at the conference as well, is really simple, that let's work to build a seasonal calendar in a lot of those cases. And there's a lot of merit to this too. The idea of something that comes back every year and that those items tend to sell really well. So if we look at our scores data, the average level of purchase intent for a new LTO is about a 49. The average level of purchase intent for a returning item, something that's come back seasonally, for instance, is significantly higher at a 67. So can we work with the operator and collaborate to build some sort of a seasonal calendar where we're sort of involved in that planning? And as we do that, there's a lot of data that we could tap into as well. Right? There are certain flavors that bubble up during certain parts of the year. During the fall, it's about pumpkin and apple and cranberry. During the winter, we see more activity with peppermint and hazelnut and gingerbread and some of those holiday flavors. Towards the end of winter, we see a huge push with fish as Lent starts to kick in. During spring, we see berries and tropical and citrus flavors pop up more on menus. Cabbage is on there too. And during the summer, we got watermelon, peach, pulled pork, barbecue chicken. But these are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of things that could be seasonal. So can we work to develop a more sort of planned calendar in a way, knowing that to get there, that level of planning requires some real collaboration between ourselves and the operator. And luckily, there is a model that is in place to do this. So our good friends at Kinetic 12, in conjunction with IFMA, have developed something called the Operator Collaboration Model. And this is a clear, sort of easy-to-understand way of bringing the parties together with aligned goals. And it all sort of boils down to a simple exhibit, a pyramid that describes the type of relationship that the manufacturer and the operator has. Anything from a purely transactional relationship, where it's just about delivering the right product at the right price, to a much more strategic relationship at the top, where the processes are integrated together and it really accommodates a deeper level of planning and a much longer-term relationship as a result as well. So we won't go into this in too much more detail. There's a lot of material around this, and the folks at Kinetic 12 do a great training program around the operator collaboration model. And towards the end of this call, we'll announce a couple of dates too, when you maybe, if you choose to, can attend the next training session that they do. But the notion of collaboration is really sort of important, because if we're not aligned with what the customer wants, it's not going to be a successful end result. So the other thing is the notion of innovation with a purpose, not just generalized innovation within a vacuum, but innovation with a specific purpose in mind. And, you know, if we're going to build a bridge, the bridge should be going somewhere, essentially. And if we think about where things sort of fall out, here's an example for some work that we've been doing with Arby's. So we know from our brand tracker, which we call brand fingerprints, that compared to its near-in sort of competitive set of other big QSRs, Arby's scores really well in the area of taste. But it doesn't have a lot of frequency to its traffic, that the amount of time that people wait between one visit to Arby's and another is significantly long, much longer than it is for other chains. So the goal then becomes to introduce items as LTOs that maybe can become seasonal items, that can maybe eventually make it to the permanent menu, that drive frequency. What are the items that could be brought to the menu that could get people to visit Arby's more often, more frequently than they have in the past? And having that perspective is really sort of important, so we know what the end goal is. And when you take an item to test or to evaluate an item, you could evaluate it for the measure that matters most. And in this case, one of those measures is, would you have it all the time? We also want to understand what each operator is known for, right? So if you look at maybe a brand like a Red Lobster and you were to ask people, well, what do you think of when you think of Red Lobster? What are the foods, what are the craveable items that first sort of come to mind? You get a lot of things you might expect, like seafood and shrimp and lobster. You get a pretty clear, immediate reaction as to what the food means for that brand to the consumer. But you also start to see things bubble up that are very, very specific to that brand. In the case of Red Lobster, it might be Cheddar Bay biscuits, for instance, right? Not a seafood item, but something that's so inherently associated with the brand. Or if we were looking at a Wendy's, for instance, It's burgers and fries, sure, but look at how high Frosty is on that list, almost as high as French fries are, or chili pops up, or the fact that you can get a baked potato there, or even something specific like the Baconator. These are all things that resonate, and some of these maybe started as an LTO and went full-time, but the thing is they tell us a story of what the consumer thinks of the food at that place. And the question is, do you want to play to that, or do you want to introduce something else? Let's say we were looking at the world of salads, for instance. Who are the top-rated chains for salads? So at the top, you have Panera, Zaxby's is on that list, Olive Garden, Jason's Deli, McAllister's. These are the top 5 rated chains across all the major ones in the world of salad. Or maybe we're looking at burgers. It's a different list, right? It's Five Guys and In-N-Out and Culver's and Red Robin and Smash Burger. And before we start moving into the actual innovation process or the ideation process, we want to sort of consider all those factors that we're developing with an objective in mind. Are we looking to build on the strengths of that brand, what they're already known to do well, or are we looking to address potential weaknesses in what they do? Find where the gaps are and say, hey, let's bring in some new items for your menu that will help you shore up here versus the competition, versus just continuing to sort of emphasize things that are already a strong point for them. Another thing that you may want to do in working with your customers to help them understand the competitive world of LTOs, not just what's offered, but also what is most relevant to them. So with our Firefly data set, one thing we could do is we could look at a particular chain, whether it's a C-store chain or a fast food chain, whatever it is. In this case, we'll look at a C-store, we'll look at Wawa, and we can actually calculate the average distance of other competitors to every Wawa store on average. And also to note how many LTOs each of the one of those have done, so we have an understanding of, well, who's really sitting in my backyard, who's really engaging in a lot of activity, and oh, by the way, do consumers like those items that have been released at those other various chains? It's sort of an important perspective to understand what really is the key competitive set, because on average, a Dunkin' Donuts is only about 1 mile away from a Wawa, and a Panera is about 7 miles. So what's going to be more important to Wawa's business? The person that might drive an extra 7 or 8 miles to go someplace? Probably not as much so as the store that is right in their backyard, only 1.2 miles away, that's done 175 different items over just the last couple of years. So all of these, again, play to that notion of collaboration with the operator to determine what the objective is for the innovation with the LTOs. And this sort of initial setting, it predates the ideation work, but it's really sort of critical so you have sort of a target in mind. The other thing that I think we really want to focus on is what makes an LTO actually successful. So what makes the item itself a good one? And for us, it's about this notion of something that is not just appealing, but uniquely appealing, right? Has something new and different to it, but doesn't scare people away. We have a picture here of the interior of a Tesla, right? At the time when it came out, totally different type of car, ran on a different type of power source, but also instantly appealing. We want to get to that with an LTO, essentially. And if you ask consumers, again, we saw some of this data earlier, but we're going to highlight a couple of other points here. How should an LTO be different than a regular menu item? Two of the things at the top all talk about uniqueness. We want new or unique flavors, or it should be something that's difficult to find or not readily available elsewhere, right? Those are some of the defining characteristics that consumers look for in an LTO. And then if you ask consumers, are LTOs more unique than regular menu items? If you ask them point blank, the majority of them will say yes. 63% will say that LTOs are more unique. However, this is why we have to be careful about how we ask and have answered and interpret what consumers say. Because if we ask the question of, are LTOs really more unique? We saw 63% of the consumers say they are, but are they really more unique? We start to get a different picture. If we ask a consumer to rate LTOs from being extremely different to extremely similar to other regular menu items, we find pretty quickly that they're more likely to say that they are similar to other menu items than they are different. So they're thought to be a little more unique or a little more different, but not a lot more different. And this is sort of a shortcoming with what LTOs have looked like historically. We think we need to do a better job of launching things that are even more unique than we've seen in the past to satisfy that core interest that consumers have in a more unique item. Otherwise, it has no reason for being as an LTO. And there are a couple of ways you can get to uniqueness, right? You can get to uniqueness by looking at different foods or flavors or ingredients that you bring into it. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the menu adoption cycle that we use. And if we looked at the world of proteins, you would have everything from andouille sausage in that early stage inception, which is ultra unique, to something like, chicken in ubiquity, which is ultra popular but not really unique at all at this point. Or if we took it a layer deeper and said we want to look at the world of desserts, still this is just the tip of the iceberg. You have, hundreds of different flavors that you could play with, and in how you modulate those flavors, that will sort of help describe the uniqueness of the item. Do you want something that is earlier stage? Focus on those earlier stage flavors like blood orange and lavender and yuzu and cardamom. Or do you want something that has a more intrinsically built-in audience? Then focus on the things on the right, but know that you're going to be trading away some uniqueness in the process of doing so. So this is a look, as we get to the slide that says LTO distribution at the top, at how LTOs that have launched over the past couple of years, how they actually sort of fall out according to those 4 stages of the menu adoption cycle. Big chains, they don't do a whole lot of stuff in inception. That's to be expected, and almost that is what inception means by definition, is that you won't really find it at a giant chain restaurant. But you can see that there is significant activity in the adoption stage. There is a lot of activity, a slight majority of activity is in that proliferation stage, that 3rd stage of the menu adoption cycle. And then about 21% of all LTOs fall into that ubiquity stage. So that seems relatively reasonable to us, and we think what you're going to start seeing over the course of the next few years is that adoption number, which is at 25, that will start to tick up over time, because that's really where the sweet spot of the American consumer's appetite is shifting. So you think about what this means, and how does that align with what consumers want? So one nice thing is we have a data set called Scores, which is consumer ratings for every single new item and LTO that hits the menu, and we can learn a lot from this. So this is the average level of purchase interest by the stage of the menu adoption cycle. For those few items that existed in the inception stage, the average level of purchase interest for those LTOs was a 28 on a 100-point scale. As we move along the adoption cycle and go from super unique to super common to ubiquitous, the level of purchase interest for those items increases. So that might lead us to say, well, hey, let's just do a whole lot of stuff in ubiquity because that's what people want. Well, that's not the right strategy, because we have to consider a couple of other dimensions as well. Purchase intent is just one axis. The other that we want to look at right now is the notion of uniqueness. So on this chart with all the little dots, each dot represents a different LTO from the last 12 months. And what we find is that the dots that make it into that really sort of special yellow zone that we have highlighted in the upper right, those things that are super unique and also generate high interest, those are the ones that tend to sell best and perform the best overall. So that is like the holy grail, is to get into that yellow region somehow, to have something that is both unique and also instantly appealing to the consumer. And we start to see that there are things that happen at a category basis. If we took all those dots and we collapsed them into just major categories of the menu instead, we see that certain categories are better at getting closer to that upper right-hand corner than others. There's been a lot of work and renaissance in the burger category, for instance, and the average score of burgers for purchase intent and the average score of burgers for uniqueness tends to be quite strong. It's a category where where everyone has sort of come together, and we have sort of revitalized that category with new interesting burgers that are also instantly appealing to the consumer. On the flip side, you look at something like seafood, which people really like, but we're not doing a lot of interesting stuff with seafood right now, and we think there's a huge opportunity to do more unique applications of seafood to move it up into that upper right-hand quadrant as well. So certain categories are getting more attention than others over the past couple of years, but it doesn't always have to be that way. There's a lot of opportunity to improve the other categories as well. And so when we think about uniqueness, we talked about how flavors and ingredients can sort of contribute to uniqueness, but that's just one way. The other way to think about uniqueness is in the style of execution. So here are some other interesting items. The Halloween Whopper that debuted, I think, last Halloween. It's basically a Whopper, and they just colored the bun black, but super duper unique. The flavor is not perhaps any different, but the uniqueness of that bun really sort of carried through, and it scores a 99 in uniqueness in our scores data set. So at the very, very top of uniqueness. Nothing particularly unique about bacon, but when you wrap your entire pizza around it, all of a sudden that pizza is pretty darn unique. So when you have the bacon-wrapped pizza at Little Caesars, it scores nearly at the absolute top in uniqueness as well, sort of in the style of execution. Or if you look at, here's an interesting item. This is actually from Australia, I think. I think this is from a Pizza Hut down here. It's their 4 and 20 pizza, and those things that you see in the outer perimeter that look like UFOs, those are actually meat pies. So you have like a pizza in the middle that is flanked by 8 meat pies along the side. Sort of like the ultimate mashup of a mashup even. Incredibly unique, even if the individual ingredients are not necessarily so. So flavors can give us uniqueness. The style of execution can give us uniqueness. And also the story behind the item can give us uniqueness as well. So let's think about what that means. So this is one of our favorite examples. It's an item that I believe returns every year to the Cracker Barrel menu. It's one of their best-selling items. It's their campfire chicken. And you read the description: enjoy camp-style cooking over an open fire with a half chicken seasoned with Cracker Barrel campfire spice blend, slow roasted till tender with carrots, corn on the cob, red skin potatoes, chopped onion, and tomato wedges. We cook and serve it in foil to seal in all the savory juices. You look at what's in here, right? Chicken, corn, potatoes, onions, some tomatoes and carrots. It's basically chicken and potatoes. But because there's a story behind this item, it scores nearly at the top in uniqueness because it harkens back to camping. There's a special campfire spice blend, or it's cooked in foil to seal in all the savory juices. By bringing a story to the item, we can also up the uniqueness score. It's just chicken and potatoes, but it's become something much more because there is a story that drives this now. And as we look at all this, we have found that it is possible to get to something that has strong purchase intent and strong uniqueness, but to get a combination of the two does require some work. So if we look at the distribution of items, the numbers that you see in these bars here, this is the percentage of all items that make it to that threshold for purchase intent as well as for uniqueness. So to read this, 81% of all items are in at least the 10th percentile for purchase intent and also in the 10th percentile or better for uniqueness. Not a very high bar to have to clear, not a very tall hurdle, but 81% of items make it there. As we start moving along and you get to the 70th percentile, so what percentage of all items are better than 70% of all other items in purchase intent and better than 70% of all other items uniqueness? Only about 7% of all items get there. So you can make it into that yellow zone. It just takes some work to get there. And we asked ourselves an important question. We said, is there anything that those 7% of items that make it in the yellow zone that they have in common, or is it just totally random? And when we looked at the data, we said, well, actually, it looks like there are some things that those 7% of items tend to have in common. One, they're often reimagined classics. They are a new interpretation of a food or an item or a beverage that's been around for a long time and is now done in a more interesting way. Two, that they are easy and clear to understand. There is no convoluted description to the item. People can get it right away. Three, it often brings in that sense of story that we just talked about, similar to what we just saw with that campfire chicken from Cracker Barrel. And four, and the one that we want to talk about here today, is that they practice this notion of safe experimentation, right? If you remember back to that Tesla image, we said it was about being uniquely appealing. This is almost sort of saying the same thing. You want something that is experimental to some extent, but also rooted in something that is familiar so it still feels safe to the consumer, so they don't feel like they're taking a huge risk by trying it. So burn these words into your head when you think about innovation, particularly in working with chain customers. Safe experimentation. That is the mantra that you want to live by, something that is new but also rooted in the familiar. If we think back to that scatter plot of purchase intent versus uniqueness with each dot representing a different recent LTO, the stuff on the left, that's like experimentation, super unique, but no one wants to try it. We don't want that. We want the stuff on the upper right, which is super unique and also has strong purchase intent, and that tends to signify the notion of safe experimentation, where there is something unique about it, but also instantly appealing. So what we tend to look at when we evaluate LTOs are 6 core measures, among some others that we measure in scores. So we've tested, I think it's about 12,000 new items in LTOs over the past 24 months, about 6 million individual consumer ratings. And these are the 6 measures that really tend to matter most. And I wanted to call attention to the 3 at the top in particular. Unbranded purchase intent, based on the item and the description, will people order that? Uniqueness, is it new and different? And then one thing that we have not talked about yet, which is the notion of draw, which we think is really important too. The question of draw is, hey, here's an item. First tell us what you ordered, tell us if it's new and different. Then tell us, would you visit someplace just to have that item? Why does this matter? Well, if you don't have draw, then you might have an item that sells well, but it's just cannibalizing from something else on the menu because it's still the same customer coming through the door. If you have a strong draw, you're actually able to attract people to your door, and now you know that you have an item that can increase your traffic, that this is an item that you should talk about in your messaging, in your advertising, because that'll draw more people in as well. You have something that fundamentally can help change the business for that operator. And different types of items have different levels of draw. So on average, these are the average draw scores for different categories of the menu. Burgers have exceptionally strong draw, for instance, which is one of the reasons we've seen so much activity in burgers, not just from places that originally specialized in burgers, but other places over the past few years. So we want to understand what exemplifies or does not exemplify safe experimentation. Here we took an item from Alinea in Chicago, a dish they call hot potato, cold potato. We thought it would be interesting, funny, I'm not sure what the adjective is, to test that in our scores data set and see what consumers thought. Super unique, but purchase intent basically is 0. It's like one of the lowest scoring items of all time, and very low draw too because no one really understands it. So this is the opposite of safe experimentation. This is the stuff in that upper left-hand corner that we called experimental experimentation, and probably not the best idea for a chain restaurant. On the other hand, you might have something like the King's Hawaiian Brown Sugar Bacon BLT at Arby's, which we talked about this dish in Atlanta as well. Here's an LTO that really does a good job of exemplifying the notion of safe experimentation. It's safe because it's a BLT and everyone knows what a BLT is, and it's also sort of experimental, right? Because not everyone's had a King's Hawaiian bun or had not just bacon but brown sugar bacon mixed with pepper bacon. That sure is a heck of a lot of bacon on here, but it gives you sort of both sides, and this is a perfect marriage, and you see it reflected in the scores. Really strong purchase interest, high levels of uniqueness, and extraordinarily strong draw. Or you might look at this item from Champs, the short rib Wagyu burger, right? It has some things that make it interesting, like Founder's Breakfast Stout or a sriracha aioli or some things that people may not have always necessarily tried. But it's within the context of a burger. It's pictured as a burger. You get what this is as a consumer. You don't scratch your head saying, ooh, I'm not sure if I like that or not. So it hits both marks. It's unique and appealing, and again, really high levels of purchase interest, really high levels of uniqueness, and very strong draw as well. So we want to talk quickly to wrap things up about the building blocks of safe experimentation. What are some things that we could do to make things more like a safe experimentation style item? Well, one thing that we found is in working to describe an LTO to consumers, you want to have a familiar name but a unique description. If you take the really weird term, okay, weird is a bad adjective. If you take the really unique terms or the ingredients and flavors that consumers may not be as familiar with, you generally don't want to put those in the name of the item because it will scare some people away. You want to sort of tuck those into the description of the items. Now, there are certainly some exceptions to this rule, but across many items that we've looked at and tested and validated this against, you typically want to tuck it away in the description because if you put it in the name, it might confuse the consumer and they might question if they even know what that item is. So the chimichurri sauce, the queso fresco, here they exist in the description of the item, and the name of the item is just prime rib taco. So this plays on that notion of safe, the prime rib taco, but also experimental because there's that note in the description that gets to it. The other thing you want to do is you want to be able to explain the item. So we found that if you look at all menu items across all different segments, the typical menu item has about 132 characters in its name and description combined. If you look at the top 10% of most appealing items overall, it tends to have more information that's communicated. Now, this is going to be different for a limited service restaurant in a C-store than it is for a full-service restaurant, clearly. But typically, the more you provide to the consumer up to a certain point, the more you can sort of generate appeal with the consumer as well. About 157 characters, a little more than Twitter will allow, is sort of the perfect size description based on what we've seen. So make sure that the description really communicates it. You don't want to go overly crazy with the marketing sort of verbiage, but you do want to sort of make sure that this is something that really sounds good, is easily understood, and that there's a point of difference in the description of the item as well. Another notion is that ethnic flavors should be thought of as American flavors now. If you look at the fastest growing foods and flavors on menus over the past 4 years, here they are, looking at entrees in this particular case, right? And we've highlighted in blue, which is like basically half the list or more, those items that have a strong sort of ethnic or multicultural root of some sort, and it's like half the list. But what you see is that these are being executed not so much in a authentically ethnic dish, they're being executed in American-style dishes that are incorporating these multicultural flavors. So you want to think about bringing these ethnic flavors, but within an Americanized sort of modern American context, if you will. So to menu multicultural influences in a familiar format, that gets you to safe experimentation as well. The experimentation comes from the multicultural aspect. The safety comes from the fact that it's offered up in a burger or a sandwich or something else that consumers readily understand. And we see this too, right? So here's, we know that banh mi sandwiches have been a trend for a while. Here's a Saigon chicken sandwich from Atlanta Bread. Scores great in purchase intent, scores great in uniqueness. It's not the only banh mi that chains have tried over the past year or two. There have been other banh mi's that have hit that have been described as just a banh mi or with a more sort of authentic sort of name. They don't score as well. But when you call it the Saigon chicken, you take a lot of the risk out of it. And here's a really good example of how naming the item in a not unfamiliar, not risky way really helps improve consumer appeal for that item. So some of the work that you'll want to do with your customers is not just around the ideation and the creation of the product, it's also how do you describe the thing? How do you make it as appealing as possible? And finally, the notion of visualizing it. So when there is a visual that accompanies an item, consumers tend to be much more interested in the item, regardless of whether it's a pizza, pasta, dessert, or beverage, or you name it. So if you can see what it looks like, the level of risk in trying it is intrinsically lower because a picture really is worth 1,000 words. So think about that in practice, though. So you want to make sure that if you are going to LTO or to test market with the customer, that there is substantial enough merchandising around that allows the consumer in store or before they come in the store to see what the actual thing looks like. The odds of it selling will be dramatically increased if they have a visual first. And finally, there are certain ingredients that are almost like super secret weapons, if you will, and probably none is a better reflection of this than bacon. So 5.3% of all appetizers, sides, and entrees across menus overall contain bacon. Over 15% of all LTOs in those categories contain bacon. It's at a 300+% utilization rate in LTOs because it sort of is like a secret weapon. Items without bacon score 48 in purchase interest. Items with bacon score a 66. So bacon is not utterly unique in being a secret weapon ingredient, and there are others too, but it's a really good example of just how much you could do when you bring a certain ingredient into a dish that really gets people excited. So our last quick piece is just the notion of making your strategy go a little bit further and making sure that you have the best possible item reflected. And one thing that we do is we test concepts as part of our scores data set as well. We compare them, right? So it's not just everything that's already hit the menu. You can now actually test your own ideas and see how they perform and benchmark them against everything else that's ever hit the menu. And what we found is something really interesting. So if you look at the average score for purchase intent and for uniqueness for items that have actually launched in the wild, all those thousands of LTOs that debuted over the past couple of years, they are a 50 by definition, right? They're average because it's the average of everything. If you look at concepts that you can refine ahead of time by really thinking through what should this be and what's been successful elsewhere, we would have sort of expected if we were going to do a new concept, right, something that has not been tested yet, that you'd probably have something that's going to be more unique, but the purchase intent would probably be lower because you're comparing it to other items that have actually launched, right? Those items have been vetted already. But what we found is that concepts that we can help optimize score not only dramatically better in uniqueness, they also have stronger purchase interest on average than other real-world launched menu items. So there's a lot you could look at in building towards safe experimentation and following those practices that give you something that is dramatically more unique and also more appealing. And then once you test those, you could refine them even further. So as a quick recap, I know we're a little bit over time. There are a ton of LTOs that occur, every single month, every single day for every particular chain, and it's a lot for consumers to take in, and we need to bring a story back to those so they understand why this is an LTO. It's important about the notion of building a calendar with the operator. We might want everything that we sell in as an LTO to become the next Big Mac at McDonald's or the next Malibu chicken at Sizzler or what have you. But from the operator's perspective, they may just be looking for something that's there for a limited time, but they might be very open to having something that comes back seasonally every year. So let's work with them on that long-term strategy too. The notion of collaboration is a big piece of it. So would highly encourage you to get involved with the operator collaboration model training that IFMA puts on with their partner Kinetic 12. But you want to start thinking strategically with the customer so we're not just ideating in a vacuum. It's purpose-driven innovation. What is that operator's business situation now? Where does their brand sit? What are their strengths and weaknesses? How do they compare to other chains? And do we want to play to those strengths, or do we want to sort of shore up some of the gaps? And then safe experimentation, that last thing that we talked about that is so incredibly important. If you had to just pick two words from the last 45 minutes or so that you want to keep in your head, those two would be it. Safe experimentation, it's a great mantra to follow. And then finally, the notion of using all these ideas to enhance the core LTO item itself, to test it with a system like Scores or some other, and then find a way to improve it too. If you follow this, I think you do a really, really great job. And I apologize for going a little bit over. And I do see one question that we'll try to tackle real quick, which is, does it seem like there is a ceiling at which there's just so many LTOs and that consumers just say, I give up because there's just so much stuff going on? I think in a way we're sort of already there, right? Because if you ask consumers, they'll often tell you, I don't get why some of these things are LTOs. I don't get why I can only have a bacon cheeseburger for these 6 weeks of summer. Makes no sense to me. And I think the LTOs, and we've seen this in the data, that are really successful are those that don't just say limited time, but explain why they're available only for a limited time. The easy one is to use seasonal flavors, but there are a lot of other stories that we could tell above and beyond that as well. And I think if we follow sort of the principles that we see here, we'll do a much better job, not only for ourselves, but for our customers. And I think they'll start to view us more as long-term partners as a result too. So Julie, I think you might have a couple of last bits about some upcoming IFMA events, but I'd like to thank everyone for your time today. Sorry for going over. Hopefully this gave you a couple of things to think about, and you should be getting a copy of this in a PDF format following today's call. So Julie, I'll shoot it back over to you.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks everyone for joining us today on this Jack